Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're taking a really fascinating journey through what is arguably one of the most dramatic macroeconomic shifts of the past century. We are going to explore exactly how a single nation completely reinvented its economic philosophy, navigated some truly massive crises, and eventually emerged as a global powerhouse. This explainer takes a structured, completely impartial look at India's incredible economic evolution.
And really, that brings us to the core question we're answering today. Think about this for a second. How exactly did India go from a highly regulated, closed-off system where the state basically controlled almost everything to becoming the fifth largest economy in the entire world, sitting at a staggering $3.7 trillion today? What actually drove this massive transformation? And, what were the growing pains along the way?
Okay, let's dive into this and start right at the beginning. Back in the early 1950s, fresh off of independence, India was facing the absolute monumental task of nation building. We're talking about widespread poverty, illiteracy, and a huge influx of refugees that required immediate, decisive action. At the time, the free market was viewed as something that just chased high-profit activities, whereas a planned economy, well, that could systematically use the country's scarce resources to build up its productive capacity as fast as possible.
To really understand this evolution, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the dawn of planning, move right into the planned economy era, hit that dramatic 1991 tipping point, explore the liberalization leap that followed, and finally, look at the modern scorecard to assess these reforms objectively.
Section 1. The Dawn of Planning. Before the first five-year plan.
This whole idea of a centrally planned economy, it didn't just drop out of the sky. It had really deep pre-independence roots, and global events played a massive role here. Think back to the Great Depression in the 1930s. While the rest of the world was collapsing, the Soviet Union's planned economy seemingly insulated it. That deeply influenced Indian leaders. They genuinely believed democracy and socialism had to go hand in hand. The intellectual groundwork started early. A 1934 book called Planned Economy for India, a National Planning Committee in 1938, and even a 1944 Bombay Plan pushed by prominent industrialists. All of this consensus finally culminated in the establishment of the National Planning Commission in 1950.
Moving on to Section 2, the Planned Economy Era, the Nehru-Mahalanobis Strategy.
So with the institutional framework all set up, the newly independent Indian state basically took the wheel. The defining philosophy of this whole era is known as the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy. This required the state to step in directly. They were going to be the primary investor and producer. And the main focus? Rapid, heavy industrialization. We're talking about building massive dams and huge steel plants, famously dubbed the temples of modern India. This strategy also leaned heavily on something called import substitution. Basically, India wanted to produce everything domestically rather than relying on bringing in foreign goods.
And this brilliantly illustrates how that initial optimism met some really harsh realities pretty quickly. By the mid-1960s, a severe macroeconomic crisis hit the country. You had sluggish agricultural growth, back-to-back brutal droughts, and the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War all putting a massive strain on the system. It actually got so bad that the government had to delay the fourth five-year plan entirely, replacing it with 3 annual plan holidays. The state was even forced to devalue the rupee and rapidly launch the Green Revolution just to make sure people had enough food.
But beyond those sudden external shocks, the structural cracks were really starting to widen. The sources detail quite a few ill effects of this early planning strategy. Without any real foreign competition pushing them, Indian industries became pretty inefficient and technologically backward. This is when the infamous License Raj emerged. It was basically a nightmare labyrinth of regulations and permits that totally suffocated everyday entrepreneurship, but ironically allowed huge monopolies to grow because the system favored large, established industrial houses. Add in excessive political interference and a total obsession with self-sufficiency that crippled exports, and you've got a recipe for mounting trade deficits and a rapidly growing foreign debt.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1991 tipping point, the balance of payments crisis.
Those mounting debts and deep inefficiencies meant the old system was essentially on borrowed time. Picture this. It's 1991, and India's macroeconomic structure is on the verge of total collapse. The country is literally standing on the edge of defaulting on its foreign loans. Sure, the 1980s had seen some economic growth, but it was dangerously fueled by heavy fiscal imbalances and foreign borrowing. Then, the spark that lit the powder keg, the 1990 Gulf crisis. Oil prices went through the roof, inflation skyrocketed, foreign exchange reserves completely tanked, and international lenders just slammed the door shut on any fresh credit.
The government had to scramble to manage this balance of payments crisis with some incredibly extreme emergency measures. So the crucial point is things were so dire, they resorted to physically transporting and pledging the nation's actual gold reserves overseas just to get their hands on foreign currency. They steeply devalued the rupee again, drastically cut back on imports, and ultimately they had absolutely no choice but to knock on the doors of multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank for emergency financing.
Section 4. The Liberalization Leap, a New Economic Consensus.
Now, that emergency IMF money, it definitely wasn't free. It came with some very strict strings attached. The government accepted the conditions and launched the new economic policy, which was a monumental paradigm shift. Think about the contrast here. Under the old Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, the state was the producer, the regulator, the primary engine of the economy, and the country was heavily walled off from the rest of the world. The new development strategy flipped the script completely. Now, the state's role was just to be a facilitator. This meant sweeping deregulation, dismantling that suffocating license raj, actively privatizing public sector monopolies, and finally opening up and integrating the Indian economy with global markets.
So how did they actually execute this? The government kicked off a two-pronged approach. First, short-term stabilization to fix that immediate balance of payments nightmare. But second, and much more importantly, they rolled out medium to long-term structural reform measures. Step 1. Fiscal stabilization to finally rein in those massive government deficits. Step 2, internal liberalization. This meant letting the private sector actually make production decisions based on market supply and demand rather than arbitrary government quotas. And Step 3, external liberalization, which meant tearing down exchange controls and creating brand new policies specifically designed to attract foreign direct investment.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer impact of these reforms, let's look at one specific critical metric: foreign exchange reserves. In June 1991, right at the absolute rock bottom of the crisis, India's forex reserves stood at a terrifyingly low $1.1 billion. That was barely enough to cover a couple of weeks of essential imports. The country was running on fumes.
Let's move to and see how this builds over the following decades. By June 2024, India's foreign exchange reserves had skyrocketed to approximately $647 billion. It's just a staggering number, and it represents way more than just a recovery. It highlights the total transformation of the Indian economy into a highly integrated, globally competitive powerhouse with surging exports and massive, steady inflows of foreign investment.
Section 5. Assessing the Economic Reforms, the Modern Scorecard.
Okay, while those GDP and foreign exchange numbers look undeniably incredible on paper, analyzing this transition really requires us to take an impartial look at the complete macroeconomic scorecard, because what is truly fascinating here is the highly unusual structural transformation of India's economy. Normally, when a country develops, it shifts from agriculture to industry and manufacturing, and then eventually to services. But India practically skipped the massive industrial manufacturing phase altogether. While the agricultural sector's contribution to GDP declined and industry grew only slightly, the services sector, especially IT and software, absolutely exploded. Today, services contribute to over 50% of India's total GDP.
But, and this is a critical but, the source material points out very clearly that this growth has not been entirely inclusive. The free market approach has created some stark divides. The economic boom is heavily skewed toward rapidly growing urban centers, leaving many rural areas struggling to catch up. After 1991, public investment in agriculture actually declined, which left millions of small farmers highly vulnerable. Furthermore, because the state took a massive step back, crucial social sectors like public education and healthcare suffered from severe underinvestment. And the sources note that these widening interpersonal and regional inequalities can easily become a breeding ground for social instability.
Recognizing the need for a totally different approach to governance in this new, liberalized era, a huge, highly symbolic shift happened in 2015. The National Planning Commission, the exact same body that had been driving those five-year plans since 1950, was officially dissolved. It was replaced by a new institution called Niti Aayog. But this time, it functions not as a centralized resource allocator telling everyone what to do, but as a modern policy think tank. Its focus is on cooperative federalism and long-term strategic vision, a complete departure from the old top-down control.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really powerful thought from the sources regarding Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. It reads, "A voice like Amartya Sen is extremely important. Otherwise, we would be left gloating in our achievements without sufficient introspection in the neglected dimensions of our economy." It really forces us to take a step back and ask a fundamental question. Is a multi-trillion-dollar GDP the ultimate finish line, Or is true economic development ultimately defined by how effectively those trillions actually improve the human capabilities and the daily lives of every single citizen? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into India's economic journey, and I'll see you in the next one.